Well, enough is enough. Queenslanders have run out of patience and the state government have run out of time to fix the broken Youth Justice Act. And for weeks, we have been pleading with the government to recall Parliament early so we could debate what is going to be a historic set of changes and a historic week of sitting. And for weeks, they have refused to listen. When that became evident, we urged the state government to release their legislation so that we could all work together to improve what is a broken Youth Justice Act that, quite frankly, was broken in 2015. And on the back of it, we have a generation of repeat young offenders who know that their rights outweigh the rights of the victim. Still, the state government refused to listen. Now, in absence of that, today the LNP will be doing more governing from opposition than it appears the government is willing to do from government. And we are releasing the first of what I believe are simple and yet effective changes to begin the process of returning this community to a feeling of safety and well-being. We are putting forward 3 solutions that the government, we believe, have no other choice but to accept if they are serious about putting people ahead of politics. 1, ensuring that breach of bail is an offence. 2, removing the provision of detention as a last resort. And 3, making sure we get fair income about early intervention to help turn a life of crime around before the broken system of youth justice kicks in. Breach of bail as an offence. It is an absurdity that a court can impose conditions on a young offender, and we're effectively saying that until they steal another car or break into another house, nothing can happen. Everyone understands consequences for actions, and if we are serious, we will ensure that breach of bail is an offence. In the spirit of being transparent, our changes will ensure that happens in the Bail Act, and we give the Parliament adequate notice of that to ensure that that change is ready to go. It is absurd that in a modern era, when we have heard the government blame everyone else but themselves for the youth justice crisis, the government says courts need to do their job. Well, today we are unshackling the judiciary to do just that. And by removing the provision of detention as a last resort, it enables the courts to be able to impose this sentence that they believe is adequate. It will enable a second chance. It will also enable that those people who should not be out on the streets are able to be dealt with without that provision in place. And thirdly, we are writing to the Auditor-General to ensure that we have a proper look to create gold standard early intervention. The Premier has said that hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent on early intervention. Well, we want to know, where are the KPIs that show what's working, what's not? Let's get serious about this and let's make sure we allow young people the ability to turn their life around before they come into what is a broken youth justice system. We are serious about this. Queenslanders are demanding change. Everywhere we go and listen to the community, people are telling us they have had enough. The system was watered down in 2015. It is broken. And these are our solutions to begin the process of turning that around. Let me be clear. This will not be the LNP's full youth justice strategy. Ahead of the next election, we will have a suite of measures that show Queenslanders we are serious about dealing with this crisis. But in the meantime, these are 3 positive changes that the government have no other choice but to accept if they are willing to turn around what is a broken system. Jarrod and Laura will be saying a few words now. Hi, Jarrod.
Well, thank you, David, and good morning. Jarrod Bleijie, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Well, it's clear we have to act on the youth justice in Queensland. Queenslanders are suffering the consequences of weakened youth justice laws that Anastasia Palaszczuk herself, her government, introduced in 2015. From 2015, we saw many new legislation, and that legislation was designed to weaken our youth justice laws. As the Leader of the Opposition has said, enough is enough. Our Queensland community are crying out for change. The priority of any government should be the safety of its citizens. And I think it's clear to see over the last 8 years, Queenslanders have had enough. They've had enough of their homes being broken into. They've had enough of the assaults onto people, person and property. Tradies have had enough of their utes being stolen from their front, their tools being stolen from their utes. Queenslanders have had enough. Queenslanders are living in fear in their own communities. They're afraid to go out. We saw it Toowoomba. The leader of the opposition and I were in Toowoomba 2 days ago. We talked to victims of crime. People are afraid to hang their washing in their backyard without making sure their house is in lockdown. What sort of society is this where people, Queenslanders, are thinking this? It is the consequences of weakened youth justice laws that when Yvette Darth was the Attorney General, she introduced. And we have seen offending rate go up, offenders go up, crime go up, and hesitation and anxiety in our community at an all-time high because of these offending rates. We are going into Parliament next week with these 3 reforms, as the Leader of the Opposition has said. And I would call on the state government to support these reforms. Accept, acknowledge that they got it wrong in 2015-16 when they started weakening the laws. Apologise to Queenslanders. Because of these weak laws we've seen now, the offending rates go up and offenders go up. Enough's enough. It's time to act on these reforms. I have written to the Auditor General because early intervention is a huge part of this. Absolutely a huge part. There is a cohort of young offenders out there at the moment that we need to be able to take off our streets to protect our citizens. But there is also a bunch of young kids that can change their lives around. But what opportunity are they getting to change their lives around? To get out of this, to break the cycle, we need to do it. The government have said they're spending nearly $1 billion on early intervention programs. Well, how can that be the case? Where's the money being invested? How can it be the case when we're seeing the offending so high in our communities? We've looked at the statistics. We've looked at the statistics from when we introduced laws between 2012 and 2015 under an LNP government and when Anastasia Palaszczuk was elected Premier 8 years ago. We've seen the statistics. And what it bears out is quite clear. That under Labor and their weakened laws, there are more young criminals in Queensland. We'll give you the statistics and we're releasing them today. But you can clearly see a pattern. When the LNP government was in power, the offenders were going down. The number of offenders were going down. As soon as Anastasia Palaszczuk weakened the laws from 2015-2016, the number of offenders skyrocketed. In fact, in 2019-20, there were over 3,500 more young offenders before our courts than a few years earlier. It is a pattern, and it is clear to see an LNP government with a minus in front of it when offenders were going down. Offending rates were going down. Crime was going down under an LNP government. And as soon as Labor was elected and they changed the laws, it's gone up. Offenders have gone up. And you know who's suffering the consequences of that? Queenslanders. Homes are being broken into. They're being assaulted. The statistics also bear out that of those offenders, it was for robbery, unlawful entry, theft and deception. 45.8% robbery, unlawful entry. And look at what we're dealing with. The Toowoomba Crime Forum the other night, hundreds of people gathered in a room demanding the Premier act. She didn't show up. A lot of it was unlawful entry, homes being broken into. Things have got to change. Queenslanders are over it. Queenslanders are demanding action. And I'd say to the Palaszczuk Labor government, put your pride aside, acknowledge the fact that when you changed the laws and continued to change the laws, offending rates went up, offender numbers went up, and Queensland is a less safe place to live today than it was 8 years ago when the Palaszczuk government was elected. Laura.
Thank you, everyone. Look, we're here today because victims of crime have been failed. They've been failed by a failure to lead, and they've been failed by youth justice laws that are broken. And we're talking about victims of crime like the Lovells, like the Ledbetters, and like the Beaumonts. Now, they've been failed because we are in a youth crime epidemic as a result of youth justice laws that were watered down when the Palaszczuk Labor government came to power. And the LNP today has introduced a plan to see those victims of crime, to hear those victims of crime. And it involves embedding in the Youth Justice Act consequences for action. It involves unshackling the judiciary. And it involves ensuring that we have a gold standard early intervention program. And I think that is one of the most important parts of our plan, because we've seen that the Palaszczuk Labor government isn't listening to those victims of crime. Just yesterday, Palaszczuk flew over to Toowoomba and did not even stop to listen to that community that has been so traumatised by youth crime. They're not listening. Early intervention programs are what's needed in order to stop the cycle of crime. But the Palaszczuk Labor government has refused to look at KPIs and has refused to deep dive into those programs so that we can work out what is and isn't working. Because in order to ensure that those kids that are coming into contact with the youth justice system, in order to ensure that their lives are turned around, those early intervention programs need to be working. But they're not. We have seen the cohort of serious repeat offenders rise from 10% to now being 17%. That means more and more kids come into contact with the youth justice system and not getting the programs and the early intervention they need to turn their lives around. And that is a complete tragedy. And that is an indictment on this state Labor government. And that is why the LNP is introducing this plan. And that is why we have been listening to Queenslanders and working on this. Because ultimately, we're doing what the government should have been doing. And Queenslanders deserve a whole lot better.
Well done, Laura. Thanks, Jarrod. Thank you. Over to you.
David, obviously the laws are very different to 2015, but also the economy is as well. How much do you think out there people are really hurting? How much of that is playing a factor in this youth crime crisis, or is it just Labor's laws in your opinion? Well,
it's been year on year, every year. And the government has a shopping list of people they want to blame, police, parents, the courts. The blame rests in the mirror. And when you water down laws and you don't get serious about early intervention, the result is a generation that know that their rights are greater than the rights of the victim. And if you want the greatest proof of that, have a look at young yahoos hanging out of the sunroof of a car taunting police to chase them on the M1. Have a look at kids in a car park of a police station in Townsville doing burnouts. Have a look at kids carrying knives around as though they can just conduct themselves with absolute immunity. And then they post it on social media and put their face there because they know that their rights outstrip the rights of the victim. And it's broken. And we can have a look at all of the shopping lists of excuses, but in the end, if you have a society where there aren't consequences for actions and you don't get serious about early intervention, you fail at both ends of the spectrum. And we're living through that at the moment.
Just with the breach of bail, did the LNP have that before and then the Palaszczuk government took it away?
Yeah, that was one of the changes the government made in 2015, and we believe that putting it in the Bail Act is the best place to put it. But in the end, what it does is it enables conditions that have been imposed for people to be held accountable for that. And to unpack it, a court might say, for example, well, okay, we're going to give you the privilege of being out on bail, but that involves you have to be home before 10 o'clock and you have to reside with a trusted person here and you can't hang around young Johnny. Now, at the moment, until that person commits another crime, they can't be held accountable for that. Now, that's an absurd situation.
So they took that away?
Yes.
Why did they do that?
Microphone
What was the reason behind that?
Sorry, David, just got to issue. Which mic is it?
This one.
Just you move your arm. No, don't move the microphone. Just
No,
your
no, no.
arm. That's it. Thank you.
I'll let you do it next time.
I'm Italian. I use my hands as prerequisite.
Me too.
So they took
Yeah,
that away? Why did they take that
well,
away?
that's a matter for the government.
Yeah.
That's a matter for the government.
But they definitely took it off, took it away.
Yes.
David, how confident are you that you will be able to get a good look at those KPIs when it comes to the early intervention?
Great question. It's essential, and good governments measure. They plan, they deliver, and they evaluate. And at the moment, we're not getting that across a range of frontline service delivery failures. And one of the things I'm committed to is being genuine, openly and transparently in the way that we conduct ourselves. I've already announced that we will have a Minister for Open Data. We'll have a Minister for Customer Service and we will have a Minister for Integrity. Now, all three of those positions don't exist at the moment. By being honest about data and sharing it, it enables your ministers to be held accountable. It enables cultural change to be driven. And we are serious about that. So part of the early intervention strategy, and the Deputy Leader has already written to the Auditor General, we want to see a look at all of those programs and let's see what's working, what's not. But above all, let's see what's being spent, what's the outcome, and how can we make sure that every dollar we spend turns around young people's lives. And you'll hear our tone today. We're not here today to say that kids don't deserve a second chance. That's not what we're about. In fact, quite on the contrary, on the back of the way the government's conducted itself, the hardcore repeat offenders have gone from 10% to 17%. So that shows you that they're failing at both ends of the spectrum. But at the other end of the spectrum, we want to unshackle the judiciary to be able to say if somebody doesn't deserve to be out in the community, they shouldn't be. And that's a fair and reasonable balance, and it's one we're willing to strike. Now, we haven't seen the government's changes, neither have any Queenslanders, and we have stood beside victims of crime who are just shaking their head to say, surely we deserve to have a look at that so we can have their say. They have done zero listening, zero consultation, and it's been all about media management rather than law and order management, and that's heartbreaking. Now, we have waited patiently. We've asked the government, show the legislation and let's work on it together. But in absence of that, we are showing leadership today. And we are being fair dinkum about putting those changes on the table so that we can take the first steps towards healing it. And it's making sure that breach of bail is an offence, that detention as a last resort is removed, and that we get serious about gold standard early intervention. That's what a plan looks like. That's what listening looks like. And it's time for the government to do the same.
So with the new changes going to Parliament this week, I don't think anyone's really expecting to see a drastic change in crime immediately once it's put in. What are you willing to give a certain time frame before you base the changes on their merits, or whether they do or don't have an impact on this crime?
Well, if the government was serious about listening and they enacted these strategies that we're proposing, two of them could have immediate impacts. If you signal that there are consequences for actions, that deters bad behaviour. If you unshackle the judiciary and allow the provision of detention as a last resort to be removed, that delivers immediate action. Now, we'll work with any stakeholder who have long-term plans as well, and that's part of the reason why the Deputy Leader has written to the Auditor General. We are serious about long-term reform, but we also believe that we have a crisis in the here and now. And these changes that we are proposing could have an immediate impact to start turning that huge escalation in crime numbers around.
More youths are locked up under these laws if they did come into effect. Would our correction system be able to cope? Would that require more funding, do you think, from the government?
Well, in 2018, the government was warned about this, and we had the Watch House crisis at that time, and they were warned, and they didn't act. I will make this point though: if we can get the balance right between turning young kids around early and ensuring that those hardcore are dealt with so they're not in the community leading the next generation astray, that will have a positive impact in that regard. And it can be done. And the numbers that Jarrod showed today reflect that. So we are serious about this. We are serious about making sure that the courts are able to do their job, that the worst of the worst are dealt with, and that we give every opportunity to have a gold standard when it comes to early intervention. Gold standard.
When it comes to that, what, in your mind at the moment, what do you think that would look like? Do you have any specific ideas of whether it's, I suppose, an easier outlet for these kids to get involved in certain programs? Do you know what it looks like at this stage?
We're open-minded. At the moment, we don't know what the government is doing. The Premier said the other day that they're spending $800 million on early intervention. Well, we don't know what that looks like, and the community doesn't know what it looks like, and I would argue maybe the government also doesn't know. So we're happy to have a proper analysis, but I'll make this point. Education, employment, aspiration, that they're at the cornerstone of how you turn around a young kid's life, and it is possible. And if we're serious about it and we make this a laser-like focus, we can turn around the next generation. But I stress, we have an issue in the here and now that also has to be dealt with, and the government's refusing to acknowledge. And when you see the transition from young kids once trying to break into a home and bolting the moment that they heard a noise, to now carrying knives and being so brazen that they put their face on social media, you know that you have a crisis right now that needs to be dealt with. And that looks like embedding consequences for actions.
Going on from what you mentioned before about the brazenness, carrying machetes, do you feel that we might face a flashpoint at some stage soon where we've obviously had flashpoints along the way with the lead betters and everything like that? Do you think it's only a matter of time before we end up seeing one of these children be killed because they go into the wrong house at the wrong time and people are prepared out of anxiety or out of...
Well, I'll ask Laura to make some comments about that. She spent a lot of time listening to victims, but I'll just make this point: good governments view community safety as their number one priority, and if the government was serious, there are solutions that have been put on the table that they should enact. And we are conducting ourselves in a responsible manner on this, and we have been listening. We've been listening a lot, and we want the government to do the same. Did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, look, I'll just make the comment that we already have seen youths die as a result of they stealing cars, and there was that carload of 5 youths. 4 of them died as a result of that. Now, they were on bail. If we had consequences for action embedded in the Youth Justice Act, maybe they could have been saved. And I do fear that we will end up at a flashpoint where we see more youths not just being failed by a broken system, but losing their lives when something could have been done to prevent it.
Thanks, Laura. Any other issues?
Opposition Leader, just on the 2032 Olympics, the Lord Mayor is calling for it to be car-free.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, I'll make a couple of comments and then I might ask the Deputy, who's a Shadow Minister as well. But I applaud the Lord Mayor for being the person who's actually talking about something other than just the sports element of it. So far we've seen $7 billion announced in spending and not $1 to improve transport or roads. And if the Olympics are to be a success, it has to be about making Queenslanders' lives better across the state for a generation. It's not about just the event. Now, there are some people who seem solely focused on just the red carpet element of it. I'm focused on making this as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to deliver infrastructure right across Queensland, a 20-year tourism vision, a transport strategy to make sure that people can get around, new roads, new opportunities, new infrastructure. Do you want to say something about Adrian's comments?
Thanks, David. I'm really concerned about where this is all heading because only a year ago the Premier announced the Gabba was $1 billion. We've seen it now blow out to $2.7 billion. We've seen a $7 billion commitment both from the federal and the state government without too much consultation. We're seeing communities yesterday up in arms about the PDA that was announced, part of the strategy. The Lord Mayor wasn't even consulted on the PDA strategy, and he's the Vice Chair of the Olympic Committee. We've seen the school community up in arms in East Brisbane because the Premier already made an announcement and said what was going to happen, but then there's consultation apparently happening after the government's already decided what was going to happen. There's a bit of chaos happening, and I fear that Queensland will be left behind on this. The whole point of having an early announcement for the Olympics was to give plenty of runway, plenty of time for the planning to happen, but there doesn't seem much planning happening. There seems a lot of announcements, a lot of photo opportunities, a lot of what's happening after the Olympics for legacy issues, but not too much in the here and now. So I applaud Lord Mayor Adrian Schrinner for actually looking and talking about transport because he sees that in the LA Olympics in 2028 as a huge issue where only 9% of the population are even catching public transport. So he actually sees it as a huge issue. In the $7 billion that was announced with the federal and state governments, that's just on stadiums. Huge blowouts, I might add, but that's just on stadiums. There's no commitment for rail to the Sunshine Coast, heavy passenger rail, which was meant to be part of the Olympic strategy, from Biwa to Caloundra to Kawana to Maroochydore, heavy passenger rail. That's billions of dollars of infrastructure as well. Is the government even considering that now? Is it on the back burner? Is it in the never ever? I am really concerned that this government is too focused on photo opportunities, glitz and glamour of the Olympics, the opening ceremony, because that's what the Premier said the other day about the Gabba. She didn't even say what sports we're going to be at. She goes, we're going to have the opening ceremony here. The Olympics is more than glitz, glamour, flashing lights, parades. It's actually an Olympics, international sport for the Olympics. So there is more to it than glitz and glamour. And I feel the state government actually don't understand that. And I would tell them to get back to the business of Olympics. This is meant to be the Olympics for all of Queensland. Well, show us how all of Queensland will benefit from the spend.
Tony says she's confident those costs won't blow out again.
Well, okay. All right. The Premier, good question. The Premier says she's confident the costs won't blow out. All right. Here we go. She said $1 billion was going to be the Gabba redevelopment. It's now $2.7 billion, which is a 300% blowout from its original budget estimate. She stood there with the Treasurer, the Deputy Premier, out the front of the Gabba. It was going to be $1 billion. She was asked a few days ago, how confident is she that the $2.7 billion won't blow out? And she said she's pretty confident. When asked why the blowout, she said, commodities and, this is happening everywhere, she said. Well, okay. If you're telling me that a Queenslander who's doing a renovation at the moment is experiencing over 300% blowouts on materials, there is cost increases, I might add, but a 300% blowout from $1 billion to $2.7 billion, seriously, they don't know what they're talking about. Look at the Cross River Rail, now an $8 billion project, blown out by billions of dollars. Look at the Coomera Connector and light rail on the Gold Coast, blowouts. This government has a legacy of budget blowouts. They can't manage money. So the Premier might say, this is all normal. Well, it is for the Labor state government. Blowouts are normal for the Labor state government. They're not normal for other venues and Olympic infrastructure around the world. It is a state Labor government issue in Queensland. And I am not confident that it won't blow out more. And I'll finish on this. It's about transparency as well. We have a government now that has the Director General of the Department of State Development who's overseeing the Olympics. The government have appointed the Director General, Mike Kaiser, former Labor Member of Parliament, also as the Coordinator General. It's meant to be independent. He will be overseeing the Coordinator General's office, which is himself. He will sign off on the projects. He will refer them to the Coordinator General, which is himself. The Coordinator General, being Mike Kaiser, will sign it, send it back to himself. He must have 2 in-trays on his desk, in and out, for himself. This is about transparency. They should have an independent Olympic delivery infrastructure authority, but they are bringing it in-house. And I'm concerned why they're bringing it in-house is because they can hide the costs from Queenslanders. Premier Palaszczuk, this is not your money. This is Queensland taxpayer money. It is their money, and there should be transparency about how you spend it.
Anything else?
Opposition leader, ABC did a story yesterday about Nathaniel Train, and apparently he was allowed, or he purchased some ammunition from around the area. He gave, just his paper copy, and they said, yep, all good, you can buy the ammunition or whatever. Does it seem a bit crazy to you that there is an online tool that they can use in shops to see whether someone's licence is suspended or not, but it's not mandatory to have a look at that? Does that seem crazy?
But, congratulations on the story. Let's go back a step first. And I said yesterday about the failure in service delivery that we're seeing across the board, and we're hearing it when it comes to weapons licensing as well. But having looked at your story and reflected, I'll make this observation. When your car rego runs out, you have to hand back the plates of your vehicle. So surely the same thing should apply to a weapons licence. So don't put it all on the dealer. It's also a responsibility of the state government to deal with that. And I think your stories raise some really serious things that need to be looked at. And we spent a lot of time looking at weapons licensing because we are seeing failures at the front line when it comes to resourcing. There is no doubt about it. And a good weapons licensing system would enable law-abiding people to be able to get access to things they're entitled to and to ensure that those with bad intentions don't. And at the moment, that's not happening. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
you.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
See you later.